Did you read the dress code? She sneered on her very first day, waving the handbook in my face. You are fired. Down in the lobby, the $8 billion investor hugged me, ready to sign the merger of the decade he asked. I smiled. I am afraid not. She just fired me, so the deal is off. He turned to her eyes, absolute ice. You did what? I am Kendra, 34 years old, and a senior strategy executive. I spent my entire career building an empire for people who viewed me as disposable. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. It was a Tuesday morning on the 40th floor of Caldwell Partners. The glass walls of the executive boardroom offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, but my focus was entirely on the thick stack of documents spread across the long mahogany table. Today was the culmination of 14 months of sleepless nights and precise financial modeling. We were hours away from closing an $8 billion merger with Thorne Industries. Maxwell Thorne, a self-made billionaire who notoriously despised corporate bureaucracy, was flying in specifically to sign the final papers with me. I was wearing a tailored cream pantsuit, a deliberate choice that projected both absolute confidence and approachability. I was reviewing the final asset allocation charts when the heavy glass doors swung open so violently they banged against the stoppers. In marched Gia Caldwell. She was 26 years old, fresh out of a business program her father had bought her way through, and today was her first day as executive vice president. She wore a hot pink designer dress, more appropriate for a nightclub than a financial firm. Following closely behind her were two men I trusted more than anyone. First was Jason, my fiancé of 2 years, a mid-level manager in my department. Next to him was Andre, my African-American brother-in-law, who married my sister Monica. Andre was a junior executive from a prominent political family in Atlanta, highly ambitious and constantly seeking ways to climb the corporate ladder at any cost. I barely had time to look up from my spreadsheets before Gia slammed a thick employee handbook directly onto the legal documents I was reviewing. The smack echoed sharply through the room. "What exactly do you think you are wearing?" she demanded, her voice shrill. I blinked, taken aback. I am wearing professional business attire, Gia. We have the Thorne merger signing in less than 2 hours. I need to finish reviewing these final clauses. Gia let out a loud, mocking laugh. Professional business attire, she repeated, looking me up and down with disgust. You look like a cheap secretary. This is Caldwell Partners. We represent wealth and power. Did you even read the dress code policy before deciding to show up looking like a complete embarrassment to my father's company? I stood up slowly, matching her chaotic energy with chilling calmness. I have worked at this firm for 10 years, Gia. My wardrobe has never been an issue for the clients who actually bring in the revenue. If you bother to check the financial history of this firm, instead of just memorizing your new title, you will see that I personally saved your father's company from total bankruptcy 5 years ago. When Caldwell Partners was drowning in toxic debt, I brought in the accounts that kept the lights on. I built the portfolio that allows you to stand here today, waving that handbook in my face. Gia's face turned a violent shade of red. How dare you speak to me like that, she screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger inches from my face. This is my father's company, which means it is my company. I am the heir to this empire, and I will not be disrespected by some arrogant employee who forgets her place. You think you are indispensable just because you talk to a few rich old men. You are nothing. You are fired. Get your things and get out of my building right now. She lunged forward and yanked my corporate security badge off the lapel of my jacket, snapping the fabric lanyard. I am stripping your access immediately, she announced, a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. Let us see how important you really are when you are standing on the sidewalk with absolutely nothing. The sheer absurdity of being fired by a 26-year-old nepotism hire on the day of the biggest merger in corporate history was staggering, but the true heartbreak was not coming from Gia. I slowly turned my gaze away from her flushed face and looked toward the doorway. Jason and Andre stood there completely silent. I waited for them to step forward. I waited for Jason, the man who promised to spend his life protecting me, to tell this spoiled child that she was making a massive mistake. I waited for Andre family by marriage and someone I had personally mentored to speak reason. The silence in that boardroom was deafening. Neither moved a single inch. Jason actually looked away, studying the pattern on the carpet, as if it were the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. He shifted his weight nervously, taking a subtle step back to distance himself from my sinking ship. Andre just stood there, his posture completely rigid, his face carefully blank, calculating the political winds of the room. They were watching my career burn to the ground, and neither of them was willing to risk their own comfortable positions to hand me a fire extinguisher. I stared at them, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Then instead of intervening, Andre moved. He did not step forward to defend my decade of flawless service. He did not raise his voice to stop a completely baseless termination. Instead, my own brother-in-law smoothly crossed the carpeted floor and handed Gia a meticulously prepared iced coffee. He offered her a dazzling rehearsed smile. "Your order, Gia. Exactly how you like it," Andre said, his voice dripping with calculated charm. I have to say that was an impressive display of bold leadership. Caldwell Partners absolutely needs a fresh, uncompromising vision to thrive in today's market. You are cleaning house, and it is exactly the kind of decisive action this firm has been starving for. I stared at Andre, my sister's husband. He came from a highly influential political family down in Atlanta, born into a world of country clubs and strategic handshakes. I always knew he was fiercely ambitious, but I never realized he was a snake. He turned his gaze toward me, and his eyes were completely devoid of empathy. He looked at me not as family, but as an obstacle he had just successfully bypassed. With Kendra stepping down, I am fully prepared to take over her entire portfolio immediately, Andre announced to Gia, gesturing vaguely toward the multi-billion-dollar merger documents still resting on the table. The Thorne Industries deal is highly sensitive. It requires a delicate touch. Frankly, our top-tier clients need a more socially adept representative anyway. They need someone who intuitively understands the nuances of high society networking rather than someone who just crunches numbers in a back room. I can manage Maxwell Thorne and ensure this merger closes smoothly under your new leadership. The sheer audacity of his statement was almost suffocating. Andre had never even spoken to Maxwell Thorne. He had zero experience managing a portfolio of that magnitude. He was using my termination as a stepping stone, trading my livelihood for favor with the CEO's spoiled daughter. I turned my attention to Jason, my fiancé, the man who had placed a diamond ring on my finger 2 years ago. The man who shared my bed, my home, my life. Surely he would put an end to this circus. I caught his eye for a fraction of a second, pleading silently for him to speak up. Jason quickly averted his gaze. He looked down at his expensive Italian leather shoes I had bought for him as a promotion gift. Then, in a move of pure, unadulterated cowardice, Jason physically took a step back. He shuffled behind Andre, using my brother-in-law's broad shoulders as a human shield. He was actively aligning himself with the new power dynamic in the room. He was choosing his mid-level management salary over the woman who had carried his dead weight for years. Jason was a mediocre strategist, at best someone who rode my coattails to every minor success he ever had. Now faced with a mildly threatening situation, he was willing to watch me burn so he could stay warm. 2 large security guards in dark suits marched into the boardroom. They looked uncomfortable recognizing me as the executive who ran the floor, but they had their orders. Gia pointed a manicured finger in my direction, her pink acrylic nails flashing under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Escort her off the premises immediately," Gia snapped, practically vibrating with power-hungry excitement. "Make sure she does not touch any company files or steal any intellectual property on her way out. She is officially a security risk." I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum or beg for my job. Begging implies that you value the person you are pleading with, and I had absolutely no respect left for anyone in that room. I smoothly picked up my designer handbag from the leather chair. I looked at Gia with a cold, unblinking stare that made her momentarily falter. Then I looked at Andre, who offered a smug, victorious little nod. Finally, I looked at the top of Jason's head, still cowardly tucked behind my brother-in-law. I turned on my heel and walked out of the boardroom. The security guards flanked me, but I led the pace. I kept my spine completely straight and my chin parallel to the floor. Dozens of junior analysts and associates peered out from their glass cubicles, their faces pale with shock, as they watched their top executive being marched toward the elevators like a common criminal. The entire floor had gone deathly silent. They all knew that without my client roster, their year-end bonuses were going to be non-existent. I reached the elevator bank and pressed the down button. The heavy steel doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside the mahogany-paneled cab, and the security guards remained in the hallway, watching me as the doors slowly closed. The moment the metal panels sealed shut, isolating me in the quiet descending box, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting an urgent client email. Instead, it was a text from Jason. I stared at the screen as the elevator rapidly dropped toward the ground floor. The words, illuminated in the harsh light of the screen, felt like a physical knife twisting in my ribs. Gia just promoted me to director on Andre's recommendation, the message read. I can't have a fired liability dragging me down. The wedding is off. I'm moving my stuff out tonight. A fired liability. That was how my fiancé saw me. 10 years of building a career crushed by a jealous heiress. 2 years of building a relationship erased by a single text message. And a supposed family bond discarded by a brother-in-law eager for a corner office. The elevator continued its rapid, steady descent. I was entirely alone, stripped of my title, my partner, and my familial support in a matter of 15 minutes. But as the digital numbers above the door ticked downward, the initial shock began to evaporate. The cold numbness in my chest was rapidly being replaced by an entirely different sensation. It was not sorrow, and it was certainly not defeat. It was a sharp, calculating fury. Jason thought I was a liability. Andre thought he could steal my client. Gia actually thought she owned the empire I built. They were all incredibly foolish. They had just thrown a match into a powder keg, unaware I held the detonator. The elevator reached the ground floor with a soft ding. The doors slid apart, revealing the expansive, marble-clad main lobby of Caldwell Partners. I gripped my phone tightly, slipping it into my pocket. I did not shed a single tear. I stepped out, breathing in the cool, air-conditioned air. I was walking out of this building with nothing but the clothes on my back, but I knew exactly what was waiting for me. Before I could even reach the exit doors, the facility manager intercepted me at the ground floor security desk. He looked highly uncomfortable as he handed me a single flimsy cardboard box. They had hastily swept the few personal items from my desk into it while the guards escorted me down the elevator. I looked inside the container. A framed photograph of an empty beach, a heavy silver pen gifted by a former mentor, and a customized leather notebook filled with my private strategy codes. 10 years of my life. 10 years of breaking my back for Caldwell Partners condensed into a cardboard box that weighed less than 5 pounds. I gripped the cardboard edges, feeling the rough texture press against my palms. There were no tears burning my eyes. There was no trembling in my hands. Instead, a terrifying absolute calm washed over my entire body. I processed the simultaneous destruction of my career and my relationship with the clinical precision of a machine. Jason was gone, evaporating into thin air the second his comfort was threatened. The man I had shared my home with, the man who had slept beside me, had traded our entire future for a meaningless title change. Andre, the family member I had defended at every holiday dinner, had eagerly plunged the knife into my back to secure his own corner office. They thought they had broken me. They thought stripping me of my title and my upcoming marriage would leave me weeping on the sidewalk. They vastly underestimated the woman they had just betrayed. I did not build my success by relying on the kindness of cowards. I built it by being the smartest, most ruthless person in any room I entered. The main lobby of Caldwell Partners was designed specifically to intimidate. It featured soaring 30-foot ceilings, highly polished Italian marble floors, and massive stone pillars that echoed with the sharp click of expensive shoes. Usually, I walked through this space with a phone pressed to my ear, dictating terms that moved millions of dollars across international borders. Today, I was standing near the security turnstiles, a discarded asset holding a cardboard box. A few passing employees caught my eye. They quickly looked away, dropping their gazes to their phones, or suddenly becoming very interested in the floor tiles. I could hear the hushed whispers echoing off the marble walls. Assistants and junior analysts were trading urgent text messages, watching my downfall like a live theater performance. The gossip was already spreading through the corporate messaging system like wildfire. The mighty Kendra had been ousted by the CEO's reckless daughter. I watched their nervous reactions, completely understanding their fear. In a corporate environment driven heavily by nepotism, loyalty was a dangerous and expensive commodity. I stood my ground near the towering glass walls of the entrance, breathing evenly, letting the cold reality of the moment sharpen my focus. I was not rushing out the door in shame. I wanted to feel every single second of this profound betrayal. I wanted it permanently imprinted in my memory, so I would never again make the mistake of trusting people who only valued my financial utility. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a fleet of black SUVs aggressively pulled up to the curb, disregarding the parking signs entirely. The heavily tinted doors swung open in perfect unison. A team of sharp-suited lawyers stepped out first, creating a protective perimeter on the sidewalk. Then from the lead vehicle emerged Maxwell Thorne. The self-made billionaire was a truly imposing figure. At 60 years old, he possessed a relentless, commanding energy that demanded absolute submission from anyone attempting to do business with him. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair swept back, his eyes scanning the building with the predatory gaze of a man who owned entire industries. He was the founder of Thorne Industries, the $8 billion client I had spent the last 14 months carefully courting, advising, and securing. He was a man who had built his empire from dirt, rising through sheer grit and unmatched intelligence. He was notoriously difficult to please, infamous for walking out of boardrooms if he felt his time was being wasted for even a fraction of a second. He despised corporate politics, despised unearned wealth, and completely despised nepotism. Maxwell Thorne respected one thing only, and that was undeniable results. And I was the only person in this entire building who had consistently delivered those results to him. The heavy glass revolving doors spun rapidly as his entourage moved into the lobby, the collective sound of their confident footsteps drowning out the ambient noise of the building. Positioned aggressively near the center of the lobby, completely blocking the path to the private executive elevators, was the newly formed power trio. Gia Caldwell stood at the forefront, vibrating with a desperate, manic energy. She had hastily smoothed down her hot pink designer dress, attempting to project a hollow imitation of corporate authority. Directly behind her left shoulder stood Andre, tightly gripping a thick leather binder containing the merger documents I had meticulously drafted over thousands of hours. He adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffed out completely, ready to charm the billionaire with his polished Southern pedigree. Tucked securely behind Andre's right shoulder was Jason, looking exceptionally sweaty and pale, completely out of his depth, but painfully eager to claim the elevated status of a director. They were practically vibrating with anticipation, ready to bow down and kiss the ring of the man holding an $8 billion check. They honestly believed they could simply step into my shoes, smile brightly, and close the most complex financial merger of the decade without doing any of the actual work. They looked like amateur actors playing dress-up in a high-stakes world they did not remotely understand. I remained standing perfectly still near the security desk, my cardboard box held loosely against my hip. I watched Gia practice her winning artificial smile. I watched Andre straighten his expensive cuffs. I watched Jason wipe his sweaty palms on his trousers. The scene was perfectly set. The trap they had built for me was about to snap shut on their own necks. I took a slow, steady breath and waited for Maxwell Thorne to cross the vast marble floor. Maxwell Thorne moved across the vast expanse of the Caldwell Partners lobby with the heavy, undeniable momentum of a freight train. His massive legal team flanked him like a highly trained military unit, their heavy leather briefcases swinging in perfect unison. As he confidently approached the center of the room, Gia Caldwell suddenly sprang into action. She stepped directly into his path, blocking his forward movement with an aggressive, overly bright smile that stretched tight across her flushed face. "Mr. Thorne," she practically chirped, her voice echoing shrilly against the towering ceilings. "I am Gia Caldwell, the new executive vice president of this firm. It is an absolute honor to welcome you to our headquarters today." She extended her hand enthusiastically, her pink acrylic nails catching the overhead light. Right beside her, Andre stepped forward in perfect synchronization. He snapped his thick leather binder shut and thrust his hand out, flashing a carefully rehearsed 100-watt smile. "Maxwell Thorne, sir, it is a true privilege," Andre said, projecting his smooth southern charm. "I am Andre, and I will be personally overseeing your expansive portfolio from this moment forward." Maxwell did not break his stride. He did not slow down. He did not even blink. He looked at her outstretched hand with the exact same passing annoyance one might reserve for a stray piece of trash blowing across a dirty sidewalk. He looked at Andre as if the man were completely invisible. Without uttering a single syllable to either of them, Maxwell neatly sidestepped the newly minted power trio and continued walking. Her fake smile froze instantly. Andre stood perfectly still, his right hand awkwardly suspended in the empty air. Jason, hiding cowardly behind them, looked completely bewildered. The entire lobby seemed to hold its collective breath as Maxwell Thorne bypassed the executive greeting committee and walked straight toward the security turnstiles, heading directly for the woman holding a flimsy cardboard box. He stopped right in front of me, his stern, imposing expression instantly melting into a warm, genuine smile. "Kendra," he boomed, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent marble room. He reached out, completely ignoring the embarrassing box in my hands, and pulled me into a firm paternal hug. "You look incredibly sharp today. Are you ready to sign the merger of the decade and make us both a ridiculous amount of money?" I stepped back from his embrace and looked him directly in the eye. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring the superior acoustics of the grand lobby carried my words clearly back to the trio standing frozen behind him. "I am afraid not, Maxwell," I replied calmly. "She just fired me." "So the deal is off." The words hung in the chilled air like a physical shockwave. The immediate suffocating silence that descended upon the massive lobby was absolute. Behind Maxwell, all the vibrant color instantly drained from her face. Her forced smile collapsed entirely into an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. His confident posture shattered instantly, his broad shoulders dropping drastically as the harsh reality of my statement physically hit him. Jason actually grabbed the sharp edge of a nearby marble pillar just to steady himself, his face turning an unhealthy, sickening shade of gray. Maxwell Thorne slowly turned his head. The fatherly warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by a cold, terrifying fury. He fixed his unyielding gaze onto Gia, looking at her as if she were a remarkably foolish insect. He took one slow, deliberate step toward her. "You did what he demanded," his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that promised absolute destruction. Gia physically recoiled, stammering uncontrollably as she desperately tried to formulate a coherent sentence. "Well, I mean, there was a strict policy violation," she stuttered, her voice trembling violently. "She was insubordinate, Mr. Thorne, and my father entrusted me to clean up the toxic corporate culture here. It was a necessary structural change for the firm. But please do not worry, sir. The massive deal is completely secure." In her blind panic, she rapidly reached out and grabbed Andre by the arm, shoving him forcefully into the tense space between herself and the furious billionaire. "Andre will be taking over your massive account immediately," she gasped, practically hiding behind his frame. "He is highly capable, from an excellent political family, and he is fully briefed on all the complex merger documents." Andre swallowed hard, trying desperately to summon his trademark charm, but his face was slick with sudden nervous sweat. "Mr. Thorne?" Andre began, his voice completely lacking its usual smooth confidence. "I assure you Caldwell Partners values your monumental business immensely. I have personally reviewed all of the preliminary work, and I am fully prepared to facilitate the critical signing today without any interruptions whatsoever." Maxwell simply stared at Andre, his expression shifting rapidly from intense anger to profound, overwhelming disgust. The billionaire did not respond to my brother-in-law immediately. He just stared at the thick leather binder Andre was holding, the very binder containing my original work, my customized strategy, and my absolute dedication. "Do you genuinely believe," Maxwell began, his tone remarkably soft but laced with pure, undeniable venom, "that an $8 billion corporate merger is something you can just pick up and read like a comic book? You think because you flipped through some printed pages, you understand the complex financial intricacies I spent a rigorous year developing exclusively with Kendra?" Andre opened his mouth to speak, but Maxwell brutally cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his heavy hand. "Do not insult my intelligence, boy. I do not do any business with Caldwell Partners. I do business with Kendra. You are literally nothing but an empty suit playing pretend in a dangerous high-stakes world." Jason took another pathetic step backward, desperately pressing his back against the cold marble pillar to remain completely unnoticed. Gia let out a tiny squeak. I just watched them crumble entirely. "Hand me that binder," Maxwell ordered, his deep voice echoing sharply off the cold marble walls. Andre hesitated for a fraction of a second, his polished southern facade completely dissolving into raw panic. He looked at Gia for permission, but she was entirely paralyzed by fear, her eyes wide and staring blankly at the furious billionaire. "Give it to me right now before I buy this entire building just to legally throw you out the front door," Maxwell commanded. Andre practically shoved the heavy leather binder into Maxwell's outstretched hand, his fingers trembling. The billionaire snatched it away, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute contempt. He opened the thick leather cover, glancing briefly at the top page where my signature was required. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh that sent a visible shiver down Gia's spine. "You actually thought you could just swap names on a piece of paper and inherit an empire," Maxwell said softly. He gripped the thick stack of premium documents with both of his massive hands. With a sudden violent motion, Maxwell Thorne ripped the multi-billion-dollar contract right down the middle. The sound of the thick, expensive parchment tearing echoed through the silent lobby like a gunshot. Gia let out a loud gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Andre physically recoiled as if he had been struck across the face. Jason remained plastered against the stone pillar, his eyes bulging in absolute horror. Maxwell did not stop there. He stacked the torn halves together and ripped them again, reducing months of meticulous legal work and financial strategy to completely useless confetti. He tossed the shredded pieces of paper directly onto the polished floor at Gia's feet. The pages scattered across the marble, a stark visual representation of her ruined career before it had even officially begun. "Hear me very clearly." Maxwell projected his voice, ensuring that every single employee, security guard, and passing executive in the expansive lobby heard his exact words. "Caldwell Partners is nothing but a sinking ship. It is a pathetic, rotting structure built entirely on nepotism, arrogance, and profound incompetence. You people operate under the delusion that your family name carries weight in the real world. Let me educate you right now. Your name is absolutely worthless. The only reason my capital was ever going to flow into this mediocre firm was because of Kendra. She was the singular asset you possessed. She was the only person in this entire building with the intellect, the drive, and the strategic vision necessary to handle Thorne Industries. And in your infinite, blinding stupidity, you just threw her out on the street over a dress code. The entire lobby remained completely frozen. Dozens of employees who had stopped to watch my exit were now witnessing the total annihilation of their company's future. The silence was so absolute you could hear the soft flutter of the torn contract pieces settling on the floor. Gia was trembling violently, tears of pure humiliation threatening to spill over her heavily applied makeup. She tried to speak, to offer some kind of desperate apology or justification, but no words came out. Her throat worked uselessly. Andre stared at the shredded paper on the floor, his grand political ambitions and dreams of a corner office completely destroyed in less than 3 minutes. The reality of his colossal mistake was crashing down on him. He had attached his cart to a dying horse. Jason looked physically ill, realizing his new director title was tied to a company that just lost its biggest lifeline. Maxwell turned his back on the ruined executives, dismissing them entirely from his reality. He looked over at his lead attorney, a tall woman holding a sleek metal briefcase. "We are done here," Maxwell stated firmly. "Call the board of directors. Inform them that Thorne Industries is officially withdrawing all offers, and let them know exactly why." The legal team nodded in perfect unison, turning on their heels to head back toward the exit doors. They moved with absolute efficiency, leaving the chaos behind them. Maxwell then turned his attention back to me. His expression softened instantly, returning to the warm, respectful demeanor he always showed me. He looked at the flimsy cardboard box in my hands and let out a gentle sigh. "Allow me to escort you out of this miserable place, Kendra," he said softly. He formally offered me his arm, his tailored suit sleeve presenting a stark contrast to the chaotic destruction he had just unleashed behind him. I shifted my cardboard box slightly to balance it against my hip and placed my free hand resting gently on his forearm. "Thank you, Maxwell," I replied, my voice steady and clear. Together we walked slowly across the grand lobby. We did not rush. We moved with the calm, measured pace of people who had just won a war without taking a single casualty. I kept my head held high, looking straight ahead at the revolving glass doors and the bright city sunlight pouring through them. I did not look back at the people who had betrayed me. Behind us, the scene was one of complete and utter devastation. Gia Caldwell was softly sobbing, entirely humiliated in front of her entire staff on her very first day as an executive. Andre was frantically dialing his phone, desperately trying to call his wealthy parents to figure out how to salvage his ruined reputation in the financial sector. Jason remained frozen against his pillar, realizing that he had just sacrificed his upcoming marriage to an incredibly successful woman for a meaningless promotion at a company that was now financially doomed. They were trapped in the toxic wasteland they had created for themselves, surrounded by the glaring eyes of the employees they had just doomed. The security guards practically rushed to open the heavy doors for us. I stepped into the warm city air, completely free and ready for what is next. The heavy glass doors closed behind us, cutting off the suffocating atmosphere of Caldwell Partners. A sleek black Maybach was idling at the curb, its rear door already held open by a uniformed driver. Maxwell guided me toward the vehicle with a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I slid onto the plush leather seat, resting my cardboard box on the floorboard. As the heavy door shut, sealing us in absolute quiet, absolute chaos was erupting exactly 40 floors above us. Inside the corner office of the executive suite, Richard Caldwell, the CEO, and Gia's father was staring at his ringing phone in sheer disbelief. Word of the shredded contract had reached the boardroom before Gia even made it back to the elevators. The firm's stock was already experiencing pre-market turbulence just from the leaked rumors of Thorne's exit. Richard slammed his fist onto his desk just as Gia, Andre, and Jason stumbled into his office. Gia was hyperventilating, her carefully applied makeup ruined by streaks of mascara. Before her father could even demand an explanation, she launched into a desperate, frantic defense. She claimed my insubordination was an incredibly massive legal liability. She screamed that I had insulted her authority in front of the entire staff and that terminating me was the only way to protect the firm's structural integrity. Richard was not a fool. He knew my numbers and he knew the $8 billion deal was the only thing keeping the firm solvent. He turned his furious gaze to Andre, demanding to know how the transition plan had failed so catastrophically. Andre, realizing instantly that the golden goose was dead and his own neck was on the chopping block, did not hesitate for a single second. He smoothly manipulated the entire narrative, completely erasing his own direct involvement. Andre stepped forward, his face a mask of deep professional concern, and pointed a steady finger directly at Jason. He threw my former fiancé entirely under the bus. Andre claimed that Jason had aggressively pushed for my termination behind closed doors, alleging that Jason had promised he could easily manage the Thorn account himself. Andre painted a vivid picture of Jason as a jealous, incompetent partner who had fed Gia false information about my performance just to steal my job. Jason stood there absolutely dumbfounded, his jaw hanging open as the brother-in-law he had just allied with systematically destroyed his career. Jason stammered desperately, trying to deny the entirely baseless accusations immediately to save himself, but his natural cowardice made him look entirely guilty. Richard Caldwell, desperate for a scapegoat to present to the board of directors, fired Jason on the spot. Within 10 minutes of my departure, Jason found himself being escorted out of the building by the exact same security guards who had walked me out entirely ruined and completely alone. Down in the city traffic, the Maybach glided smoothly away from the towering glass building. I leaned back against the headrest, feeling the tension slowly drain from my shoulders. Maxwell poured 2 glasses of sparkling water from the chilled compartment and handed one directly to me. He did not speak immediately. He just watched the city blocks roll by, allowing me a few moments to process the magnitude of the morning. When he finally spoke, his voice was entirely devoid of the fury he had displayed in the lobby. He was back to being the sharp, calculating billionaire I had worked with for over a year. "You handled that beautifully," Kendra Maxwell said, taking a slow sip from his glass. "Most people would have shattered into a million pieces. You stood there like a stone wall. That is exactly why I trusted you with my capital in the first place. You do not let emotion dictate your strategy. You let it fuel your perfectly flawless execution." I looked at him, tracing the rim of my glass. "I did not have time to be emotional, Maxwell. I spent 10 years building a fortress for a family that locked me out the second I became inconvenient. They did not just fire me, they tried to erase me. My fiancé abandoned me via text message before I even reached the ground floor. My brother-in-law orchestrated the entire takeover to secure a corner office. I am not sad, I am simply recalibrating my trajectory." Maxwell offered a low, appreciative chuckle. "I know you are," he replied, setting his glass down very softly. "That is exactly why I pulled my capital. Richard Caldwell is a dinosaur and his daughter is a liability. That firm will bankrupt within 6 months without your portfolio to prop up their terrible investments. But I have a problem, Kendra. I have $8 billion in liquid assets that need to be deployed aggressively by the end of the fiscal quarter, and the only strategist I trust is currently unemployed and sitting in my car with a cardboard box." He turned to face me fully, his expression shifting into complete, uncompromising business focus. "I am opening a new private equity fund under the massive Thorn Industries umbrella," he then stated to me very clearly. "It will operate completely independently. We will target aggressive acquisitions, distressed assets, and corporate takeovers. I need a managing director who knows how to spot weakness and exploit it without hesitation. I want you to run the fund. You will have full autonomy, unlimited resources, and an initial compensation package that triples whatever miserable salary Caldwell was paying you, plus a 20% cut of the carried interest on every single deal you close." I stared at him, my mind rapidly calculating the sheer scale of the power he was handing me. This was not just a job offer. This was a fully funded weapon. This was the exact capital I needed. I needed to launch a silent, devastating financial war against every single person who had betrayed me. I looked at the cardboard box resting on the floor. It contained the remnants of my past life. I looked back at Maxwell Thorn, a man who recognized my absolute value without question. I smiled. "I accept your offer, Maxwell." I said, my voice completely steady and cold. "But I have one specific condition for you. When we start acquiring distressed assets, I get to choose our absolute first target." Maxwell smiled, a predatory gleam flashing in his eyes. He raised his glass in a silent toast. "Caldwell Partners will not even see us coming," he replied, clinking his heavy crystal glass gently against mine right now. The Maybach dropped me off outside my downtown apartment complex where I quietly packed a week of clothes into a single suitcase. By late evening, the pleasant hum of the city had transformed into a raging storm. Heavy slate-gray clouds hung low over the suburbs, unleashing a torrential downpour that blurred the windshield wipers into a frantic, useless rhythm. I gripped the steering wheel of my sedan, my knuckles turning white as I navigated the flooded streets. My mind was still reeling from the devastating text message Jason had sent earlier that afternoon. The man I had shared an apartment with for 2 years had erased our entire future without a single phone call, trading our relationship for a director title at a dying company. I needed a brief moment of grounding. I needed a sanctuary, a place where I could find a shred of familial comfort amidst the complete destruction of my personal and professional life. Naturally, my instincts pointed me toward my parents' house in the affluent neighborhood of Greenwich. I pulled my car into the familiar circular driveway, cutting the engine and staring up at the sprawling colonial home. The house glowed warmly against the dark, stormy night, its manicured lawn and classic white pillars, looking just as they had throughout my entire childhood. For decades, this house had been marketed to the outside world as a fortress of stability and success. But to me, it represented a lifetime of conditional affection and financial extraction. I grabbed my purse, pulled my trench coat tight against the lashing rain, and jogged up the front steps. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I reached into my bag, pulled out my spare key, and unlocked the heavy wooden front door, expecting a quiet refuge from the chaotic storm raging outside. As the door swung open, the warm air of the foyer hit me, carrying the sharp scent of expensive wine and roasted lamb. But there was no quiet waiting for me. Instead, loud laughter and upbeat music spilled out from the formal dining room down the hall. I stepped inside, shaking the heavy rain from my umbrella, and walked toward the sound. I paused at the entryway of the dining room, my wet shoes sticking slightly to the polished hardwood floor. Seated around the long mahogany table were my mother Patricia, my father Harrison, my younger sister Monica, and to my absolute shock, my brother-in-law Andre. They were surrounded by crystal flutes and half-empty bottles of vintage champagne, toasting loudly to something that sounded suspiciously like a major celebration. Patricia looked up first, her eyes locking onto mine. The warm, welcoming smile she usually wore for guests vanished instantly, replaced by a tight, judgmental frown. She looked me up and down, taking in my wet hair, my damp trench coat, and the exhaustion etched deep into my face. "Kendra," she said, her voice dripping with irritation. "Look at you. You are tracking rainwater all over the expensive Persian rug. Did you lose your mind driving out in a storm like this without calling first?" Harrison barely glanced up from his champagne glass, merely offering a dismissive grunt. Monica giggled, leaning back in her chair with a designer silk scarf draped loosely around her neck. Andre sat right beside her, wearing an expensive tailored jacket, looking entirely at home at the head of the table. I stood there in the doorway, the physical chill of the rain still clinging to my skin, while my own family treated my arrival like an inconvenient intrusion. I had driven through a dangerous downpour, seeking a safe harbor, completely forgetting that the storm inside this house was always much worse than the one outside. For the last 3 years, I had quietly shouldered 70% of my parents' monthly mortgage payments. Every single month without fail, a direct wire transfer left my corporate account to keep this sprawling roof over their heads. My father had retired early to dabble in unprofitable investments, and my mother refused to scale back her country club lifestyle. Whenever they faced a shortfall, they called me. They framed it as giving back to the people who raised me, a sacred familial duty I was obligated to fulfill. I never complained. I simply paid the bills, believing that my financial sacrifices were buying stability for the people I loved. Meanwhile, that exact same financial safety net was never extended equally. While I worked 80-hour weeks closing multi-billion-dollar deals, my parents constantly funneled their own remaining cash and free time into funding Monica and Andre's lavish lifestyle. Monica had never held a real job in her life, spending her days shopping in the city and posting curated luxury content online, entirely funded by our parents' soft spots and my silent subsidies. Andre, despite his prominent political family background in Atlanta, lived way beyond his means, constantly chasing high-risk business ventures and elite social circles. Whenever Monica needed a new luxury handbag or Andre needed capital for a speculative investment, my parents found the money often borrowing against their own equity or leaning heavily on the financial cushion I provided. I was their personal ATM, valued solely for my balance sheet. While Monica and Andre were the golden children, showered with unconditional praise and financial indulgence, the silence stretched uncomfortably across the dining room table as I stood dripping on the rug. Patricia sighed dramatically, setting her crystal flute down with a sharp clink. "Well, do not just stand there like a ghost." "Kendra," my mother snapped, breaking the silence, "if you are here to join us for dinner, you will need to go upstairs and change into something appropriate. You look an absolute mess." I stared at her, the exhaustion in my chest suddenly crystallizing into a cold, heavy realization. I had just lost my career, my fiancé, and my entire professional identity in a single afternoon, and my own mother cared more about a wet rug than my well-being. I walked slowly into the dining room, pulling out an empty chair, and sat down at the table. I looked around the room at the expensive food, the champagne, and the glowing faces of the people I had financially sustained for years. I needed to see just how deep the betrayal went. I sat at the polished mahogany table, ignoring the puddle of rainwater slowly forming around my boots on my mother's expensive rug. The clinking of crystal glasses had stopped the moment I entered, but the smug, self-satisfied energy in the room remained incredibly thick. Harrison finally put down his champagne flute and cleared his throat loudly. "We were having a private family celebration, Kendra," he announced, adjusting his expensive reading glasses. "Since you decided to barge in uninvited, you might as well congratulate your brother-in-law." "Congratulate him for what exactly?" I asked, my voice dangerously even. I folded my hands on the table, looking directly at Andre. Andre had the audacity to flash me a sympathetic, entirely fake smile. He reached over and placed his hand affectionately over Monica's hand. "Well," Andre started puffing out his chest under his tailored jacket, "it has been a wildly unpredictable day at the firm. I know you had a difficult morning with the new executive vice president, but the company has to move forward. Gia Caldwell recognized my potential and my ability to navigate high-stakes environments. She officially promoted me to Senior Director of Strategy this afternoon." Monica squeezed his hand tightly, beaming with immense pride. "And that is not even the best part," my sister chimed in, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "Andre is taking over the entire Thorne Industries account. He is going to be the lead executive on the $8 billion merger. Can you even imagine the commission on a deal that size? We are already looking at vacation homes in Aspen to celebrate." I stared at them. I looked at Monica, who was excitedly planning a luxury vacation funded by the exact client I had spent 14 sleepless months securing. I looked at Andre, who was sitting at my parents' dining table drinking their expensive champagne, actively bragging about stealing my livelihood. Then I looked at my mother. Patricia was positively glowing. She raised her glass toward Andre. To Andre, she declared proudly, "A true visionary who understands how to build a legacy. We always knew your Atlanta pedigree would take you straight to the top of the corporate ladder. You are the son we always wanted, and you are providing such a beautiful, secure life for our precious Monica." My father nodded in enthusiastic agreement. "It takes a certain kind of finesse to handle billionaires," Harrison added, cutting a piece of roasted lamb. "You need a refined background. You cannot just bully your way through negotiations like a bull in a china shop. Frankly, Kendra, your aggressive approach was always going to backfire eventually. You should take notes from Andre on how to manage these delicate corporate relationships with grace." The sheer delusion in the room was almost suffocating. They were sitting in a house I paid for, eating food I subsidized, while celebrating the man who helped orchestrate my professional assassination. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. I simply leaned back in my chair and let out a short, cold laugh. The sound cut through the warm, celebratory atmosphere like a razor blade. The smiles around the table instantly vanished. Patricia slammed her fork down onto her porcelain plate. "What on earth is so funny, Kendra?" she demanded, her face flushing with sudden anger. "Your brother-in-law achieves a monumental career milestone, something you clearly failed to maintain, and you sit there laughing like a bitter child. Have you absolutely no shame?" "I am not laughing out of bitterness, Mother," I replied, my voice dropping to a low carrying register. "I am laughing because you are all celebrating a ghost." I turned my gaze back to Andre, watching the fake confidence slowly start to melt off his face. "Did you actually tell them what happened in the lobby, Andre? Did you tell them about your delicate, refined interaction with Maxwell Thorne?" Andre swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The color began to drain from his cheeks. "It was just a minor scheduling conflict," Andre stammered quickly, refusing to meet my eyes. "Mr. Thorne was just surprised by the sudden transition. It will be smoothed over by tomorrow morning." I shook my head slowly. "A minor scheduling conflict. Is that what you are calling the complete destruction of your firm?" I looked at my parents, who were now staring back and forth between Andre and me in confusion. "Let me tell you exactly what happened today," I said clearly. "Gia Caldwell fired me. Andre and Jason stood by and did absolutely nothing. Then they boldly marched down to the lobby to introduce themselves to Maxwell Thorne. And do you know what the billionaire did? He completely ignored your refined, visionary son-in-law. He took the merger contract, the one I spent a year drafting, and he ripped it into shreds right in front of the entire company." Monica gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest. Patricia turned entirely pale. "What are you talking about?" my mother whispered. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "The $8 billion deal is gone. Maxwell Thorne pulled all of his capital. He publicly announced that Caldwell Partners is a sinking ship of nepotism and incompetence. The firm is financially doomed. They will be bankrupt in months. Your golden boy here did not secure a legacy. He secured a corner office on the Titanic. And Jason, my supposed fiancé, was fired 10 minutes later." The dining room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The reality of the situation hit them like a physical blow. But instead of showing an ounce of empathy for the fact that I had just lost my job and my impending marriage, the toxic machinery of my family immediately pivoted to self-preservation. Patricia's initial shock twisted rapidly into vicious, blinding fury. She did not direct it at Andre. She directed it entirely at me. "You ruined it!" my mother shrieked, standing up so violently her chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. "You vindictive, selfish girl. You purposely sabotaged that meeting because you could not stand to see Andre succeed." Monica began to cry, but not for me. She was crying for her Aspen vacation and her designer lifestyle. "What are we supposed to do now, Kendra?" Monica whined, dabbing her eyes with a silk napkin. "Andre promised me we were buying the new house. You are so incredibly selfish. You always ruin everything for me." I looked at my sister, a grown woman throwing a tantrum over vacation homes while her sister's life had just been detonated. Harrison leaned over the table, his eyes wide with financial panic. "Do you have any idea how much money we have tied up right now? We have obligations, Kendra, real obligations. You cannot just walk away from a firm like Caldwell Partners. You will call Gia Caldwell first thing tomorrow morning. You will apologize for whatever disrespectful thing you said, and you will beg for your job back so Andre can keep his position." I stared at my father, the words hanging in the stifling air of the dining room. Apologize, beg for my job back. I had just told them that I was publicly humiliated, stripped of my security badge, and dumped by my fiancé via a cowardly text message. Yet to my father, I was simply a broken tool that needed immediate repair so the family could continue extracting my resources. I looked at Harrison's red, panicked face. "I am not apologizing to anyone," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like glass. "Gia fired me because she is a spoiled child playing dress-up in her father's company. I did absolutely nothing wrong, and I will never grovel to a woman who destroyed my life just to flex her ego. Patricia stepped around the fallen chair, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She crossed her arms, looking at me with pure disdain. You have always been entirely too rigid. Kendra, my mother spat, her voice shaking with rage. You walk into boardrooms thinking you are the smartest person alive. You completely lack grace and social finesse. You offended the CEO's daughter on her first day because you refused to play the game. You brought this entire disaster upon yourself, and now you are punishing us for your abrasive personality. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. My damp clothes clung uncomfortably to my skin, but I felt nothing but white-hot clarity. I am rigid because I have to carry the weight of this entire family, I shot back. Who do you think pays for this dining room? Who do you think pays the mortgage on this house? My abrasive personality, working 80 hours a week, keeps you in champagne and roasted lamb. Do not dare throw your money in our faces, Patricia shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. Money is just money. It does not buy class, and it certainly does not buy a legacy. She gestured wildly toward Andre, who sat quietly letting my parents fight his battles. Andre is the future of this family, Kendra. Look at him. He comes from one of the most powerful political lineages in Atlanta. His family name opens doors that your little spreadsheets could never pry apart. He has the pedigree, the charm, and the vision to elevate our status in society. You are just a worker bee. You were meant to build the foundation so Andre and Monica could enjoy the view. Instead, you selfishly tore the whole building down because your massive ego could not handle taking orders from a Caldwell. The sheer delusion was staggering. My mother honestly believed Andre's empty political connections were more valuable than tangible capital. She willingly sacrificed her daughter to protect a son-in-law who was a catastrophic failure. I looked at Andre. He refused to meet my gaze, intensely studying his empty plate. He was perfectly content to let my parents verbally crucify me, as long as it kept the spotlight off his monumental blunder in the lobby. Harrison slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses rattle violently. Enough of this absolute nonsense, my father barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. We do not have time for your pride, Kendra. We have real-world problems right now. Monica and Andre have a lifestyle to maintain, and Jason will be ruined if he does not get his position back. You are going to fix this. You are going to pick up your phone right now. You are going to call Gia Caldwell, and you are going to beg on your hands and knees if you have to. I looked at my father, studying the frantic, desperate look in his eyes. There was something else there, something darker than just losing his favorite son-in-law's imaginary promotion. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a financial cliff, terrified of the impending drop. You want me to beg for Jason? I asked, my tone deadly quiet. The man who texted me to cancel our wedding because I was a liability to his career. You want me to beg for Andre, the man who actively tried to steal my $8 billion client while my security badge was still warm? They are your family! Harrison roared, completely ignoring the horrific betrayal I had just outlined. You have an obligation to us. You do not get to just walk away and let the rest of us drown. You will call the firm tomorrow morning. You will apologize to Gia, smooth things over with Maxwell Thorne, and restore Andre and Jason to their positions. If you must take a pay cut to make it happen, you will do it. That is what family does. I stared at the four of them. My mother practically vibrating with narcissistic rage. My father demanding I sacrifice my dignity to save his precarious social standing. My sister crying over a vacation she did not earn. And my brother-in-law the cowardly architect of this entire disaster. I felt a strange, cold peace settle heavily over my chest. For 34 years, I had desperately tried to earn their love through financial devotion and unwavering loyalty. In one single afternoon, the truth had finally been dragged out into the light. They did not love me. They never loved me. I was nothing but a highly efficient utility, and the moment my power was cut, I was immediately discarded. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my car keys. The metal jingled softly in the tense, silent room. I am never calling Gia Caldwell, I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I am never stepping foot in that firm again. I will not lift a single finger to save Jason, and I will absolutely watch Andre crash and burn with a smile on my face. You chose your visionary. Now you can let his political lineage pay your bills. The silence only lasted for a fraction of a second before the eruption occurred. Harrison's face morphed from a flushed purple into a terrifying mask of unrestrained fury. He lunged across the space between us, his large hands aggressively grabbing the wet fabric of my trench coat. He yanked me forcefully toward the entryway, his fingers digging painfully into my shoulders. Patricia followed closely behind us, her face twisted into a vicious sneer. "Get out of my house!" Harrison roared, his voice echoing. "If you are going to act like an ungrateful, selfish child who refuses to protect her own blood, then you do not belong under this roof." I did not fight him. I let him drag me toward the wooden door. The sheer absurdity of the situation stripped away any lingering desire to resist. I was the one paying for the roof he was kicking me out from under, but logic had abandoned this family. Patricia stepped in front of Harrison, reaching out to rip the spare key from my trembling hand. "You have lost your mind, Kendra." My mother spat, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "You are throwing away everything we have built just to satisfy your massive ego. We are completely done with you. Do not come back until you learn how to bow your head." She shoved the heavy door open, letting the freezing torrential rain whip aggressively into the warm foyer. Harrison roughly pushed me out onto the wet concrete of the front porch. I stumbled slightly, catching my balance just before I hit the stone steps. The icy wind cut immediately through my damp clothes, biting deep into my skin. Before Harrison could completely slam the heavy door in my face, Monica squeezed past our mother. My younger sister stood in the doorway, the warm light of the chandelier framing her perfectly styled hair. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet, malicious smile that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "You really should have just apologized to Gia." "Kendra," Monica said, her voice dripping with venomous delight. "You see, Mom and Dad needed your account to stay active. They just took out a massive second mortgage on this house last month. They gave all the cash to Andre so he could fund his new crypto and luxury real estate venture down in Atlanta. It is highly leveraged. Without your corporate salary, subsidizing the monthly payments, the bank is going to take this house in less than 90 days. You really ruined it for yourself." The heavy oak door slammed shut with a deafening thud, followed immediately by the sharp metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place. The porch light was instantly switched off, plunging me into absolute darkness. I stood frozen on the concrete steps as the freezing rain battered my face and shoulders. Monica's words echoed loudly in my mind, cutting cleanly through the roaring sound of the storm. A massive second mortgage. A highly risky crypto and real estate venture led by Andre. The absolute magnitude of their financial stupidity washed over me like a physical wave. They had not just bet on Andre's imaginary political pedigree. They had literally bet the entire house on it. They had secretly leveraged the very roof over their heads, the roof I was paying for, to fund a volatile, unregulated gamble, orchestrated by a man who had just proven he could not even hold a conversation with a real billionaire. They were not just a toxic family anymore. They were a sinking ship rapidly taking on water, and they had just violently thrown their only life raft out into the ocean. I walked slowly down the driveway, my boots splashing heavily through the deep puddles. I reached my sedan, unlocked the door, and practically collapsed into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut, trapping the damp, cold air inside with me. I turned the key in the ignition, blasting the heater on full power, and wrapped my trembling arms tightly around my chest. I sat there in the dimly lit car, watching the rain violently pound against the windshield. I had no job. I had no fiancé. I had no family. But as the warmth from the car heater slowly began to thaw my freezing skin, a deep, profound sense of liberation began to take root in my chest. I was entirely dead to my family, which meant I was finally free from their parasitic grip. I no longer had to subsidize my parents' delusions. I no longer had to fund Monica's designer wardrobe. I no longer had to pretend that Jason was an equal partner. And I certainly no longer had to protect Andre from his own catastrophic incompetence. The financial ties were completely severed. They had foolishly anchored themselves to a dying company and a fraudulent investment scheme, entirely unaware that the market was about to crash directly on their heads. I leaned my head back against the seat, pulling my phone from my damp pocket. I opened my encrypted email application and began drafting a message to Maxwell Thorne. I had accepted his offer in the Maybach, but now I had a highly specific target in mind. I did not just want to build a new private equity fund. I wanted to systematically dismantle Caldwell Partners, and I wanted to quietly purchase the bad debt of my parents' home when the bank inevitably foreclosed on it. I spent the night sleeping in my car parked behind a brightly lit gas station. I was cold, exhausted, and wearing damp clothes. But as the sun began to slowly rise over the city skyline, painting the heavy clouds in shades of pale gold, my mind was sharper than it had ever been. They threw me out into the cold because they thought I was powerless. They were about to discover exactly what happens when the woman who built the empire decides to completely burn it down. 6 months evaporated in a blur of private jets, midnight strategy sessions, and the exhilarating thrill of corporate warfare. The transition from the freezing, damp driver's seat of my sedan to the sprawling penthouse suite of Thorne Capital Operations felt less like a career shift and more like a hostile takeover of my own destiny. Maxwell Thorne had not just hired an executive, he had successfully weaponized me. He handed me an unrestricted operational budget, a dedicated team of 50 ruthless financial analysts, and a corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Manhattan skyline. But the most valuable asset he provided was absolute, unquestioned autonomy. I was no longer a worker bee desperately building a fragile foundation for an ungrateful family. I was a designated apex predator in a bespoke tailored suit, and my absolute favorite hunting ground was the rapidly crumbling empire of Caldwell Partners. Every morning I arrived at my pristine marble desk before dawn, fueled by a potent mixture of dark roast coffee and cold, calculated vengeance. The strategy I deployed was not driven by brute force. It was an exercise in surgical, agonizing precision. I knew every single vulnerability, every hidden clause, and every structural weakness embedded deep within the Caldwell client portfolios because I was the exact architect who had originally built them. I did not need to break any laws or violate any non-compete agreements. I simply waited for Gia Caldwell to inevitably offend her remaining legacy clients with her breathtaking arrogance, and then I elegantly swept in to offer them a secure, highly profitable lifeboat. The first major casualty was the Sterling Logistics account. Gia had boldly attempted to force their aging board of directors into a highly aggressive tech acquisition they explicitly did not want. I scheduled a discreet dinner with their CEO at an exclusive underground club in Tribeca. By the time the dessert and check arrived, I had legally transferred their entire $400 million asset management portfolio over to Thorne Capital. That initial victory triggered a catastrophic avalanche for my former employer. Over the next several weeks, my days became a rapid-fire sequence of high-stakes business maneuvers. I poached the Horizon Healthcare merger right out from under Jason's nose, strategically leveraging his well-documented inability to comprehend complex regulatory compliance laws. I watched from the comfort of my leather chair as the business news networks broke the story of Horizon, pulling their capital, citing a severe lack of confidence in Caldwell management. Next came the Vanguard Tech Initiative. Andre had somehow convinced Gia to let him lead the quarterly presentation for Vanguard, operating under the severe delusion that his Southern political charm would compensate for his utter lack of financial literacy. According to my inside sources, Andre spent 45 minutes mispronouncing key industry terms and accidentally presented a slide deck containing severely outdated valuation metrics. I immediately capitalized on the sheer embarrassment, sending the Vanguard executives a personalized, flawless recovery strategy. They happily signed a massive contract with Thorne Capital the very next morning. I transformed the right wall of my office into a massive digital command center entirely dedicated to monitoring the real-time destruction of Caldwell Partners. It was a beautiful, mesmerizing display of corporate hemorrhage. Every single day, I watched their stock ticker blink aggressively in red. I watched their market capitalization plummet by hundreds of millions of dollars. The financial press, once entirely loyal to the prestigious Caldwell legacy, began publishing scathing exposé articles about the toxic, erratic culture festering inside the firm. The headlines were a daily source of immense personal satisfaction. They detailed a severe mass exodus of senior talent, a terrifying liquidity crisis, and a complete systemic failure of executive leadership. The firm was actively bleeding out from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds, and I was the one quietly hiding all the bandages. The most poetic aspect of the entire collapse was that I barely had to lift a finger to destroy Gia and Andre. They were systematically destroying themselves. Gia's unchecked ego was a highly destructive wrecking ball swinging wildly through the remaining company morale. She fired experienced vice presidents for daring to disagree with her unhinged directives and replaced them with inexperienced sycophants who were too terrified to warn her about impending financial cliffs. She vehemently refused to admit she was losing control, continuously doubling down on terrible investments just to prove she was the smartest woman in the room. Meanwhile, Andre was operating as a highly efficient parasite. My former brother-in-law was aggressively draining Caldwell's remaining liquid capital to secretly cover his massive, staggering losses in the crypto market. He was completely out of his depth, desperately shuffling money between offshore accounts and phantom real estate projects, trying to hide the fact that he was financially drowning. Every time a prominent client defected to Thorn Capital, Gia publicly blamed the changing market conditions. She blamed malicious rumors. She blamed absolutely everybody except herself and the profoundly incompetent men she had chosen to elevate. I sat at my desk watching a live financial broadcast where a prominent market analyst officially downgraded Caldwell Partners to a junk status investment. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The 6-month campaign of relentless systematic pressure had successfully cracked the foundation of the firm. They were desperately gasping for air, burning through their emergency cash reserves just to keep the lights on in their extravagant lobby. But driving Gia to the brink of bankruptcy was only phase 1 of my master plan. I did not just want to defeat them in the open market. I wanted to completely eradicate them from the financial sector. I reached across my desk and tapped the intercom button, calling my lead analyst into the office. It was time to completely sever their final desperate lifeline, and I knew exactly where they were hiding it. My lead analyst, a sharp young woman named Elena, walked into my office holding a sleek silver tablet. She did not need to say a single word. She simply placed the tablet on my pristine marble desk and tapped the screen. A live feed of internal corporate memos from Caldwell Partners illuminated the display. Gia Caldwell had officially panicked. In a desperate, frantic attempt to satisfy her furious board of directors and temporarily halt the massive financial bleeding, she had authorized an immediate and brutal wave of executive layoffs. The strategy was entirely transparent. She was sacrificing her most expensive, least productive staff members to artificially inflate the quarterly balance sheet. I scrolled slowly through the digital list of terminated employees, my eyes scanning the names with predatory anticipation. There it was, Jason Mercer. The man who had callously ended our engagement via a cowardly text message to secure his corporate ascent had just been unceremoniously discarded by the very woman he sold his soul to impress. He was escorted out of the building by private security, carrying his pathetic belongings in a cardboard box, entirely ruined and permanently marked as damaged goods in the financial sector. He had traded me for a golden ticket that immediately burst into flames. But Jason was merely collateral damage in the grander scheme of my revenge. The real target, the absolute epicenter of my family's toxic delusion, was Andre. I handed the tablet back to Elena and instructed her to pivot all of our surveillance resources directly onto Andre's offshore financial activities. It did not take long for his fragile house of cards to violently collapse. For months, Andre had been aggressively funneling immense amounts of capital, including the massive cash injection from my parents' second mortgage, into a highly unregulated, decentralized finance network. He had heavily leveraged their family home to buy into a luxury real estate crypto token that promised guaranteed astronomical returns. It was the exact type of flashy, high-risk garbage that attracted arrogant men who desperately wanted to be wealthy without actually doing any of the rigorous analytical work. The catastrophic implosion happened on a Tuesday morning. The global cryptocurrency market experienced a severe sudden correction, sending highly leveraged digital assets plummeting into the abyss. But Andre's venture did not just lose value, it was completely eradicated. A joint task force of federal regulators and international financial authorities raided the corporate headquarters of the token developers. The entire operation was spectacularly exposed as a massive, elaborate, fraudulent scheme. The luxury real estate portfolio they claimed to own did not actually exist. The liquidity pools were entirely drained. The developers fled the country, leaving thousands of arrogant investors holding absolutely nothing. The digital ledgers froze, and within a span of 4 terrifying hours, every single dollar Andre had invested simply vanished into the digital ether. The financial shockwave tore through my former family with absolute devastation. The massive loan my parents had taken out against their sprawling colonial home was instantly vaporized. There was no safety net, no government bailout, and absolutely no way to legally recover the stolen funds. Andre, the visionary genius with the powerful Atlanta political lineage, was suddenly staring down the barrel of insurmountable debt and potential federal indictments. The millions of dollars he had aggressively gambled away were gone, and he had zero tangible assets left to liquidate. His bank accounts were immediately frozen by nervous creditors, and the heavy, crushing weight of reality finally crashed down upon his fabricated empire. The absolute destruction of their carefully curated lifestyle unfolded in a spectacular, highly public fashion. Monica, completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse detonating around her husband, was spending her afternoon at a high-end designer boutique on Fifth Avenue. I received the details later from a mutual acquaintance who had the distinct pleasure of witnessing the entire meltdown firsthand. Monica had casually approached the register with 3 exclusive leather handbags, entirely expecting her platinum credit card to smoothly facilitate the exorbitant transaction. The cashier swiped the card. It was instantly declined. Monica, acting with her usual entitled outrage, demanded they try it again, loudly blaming the boutique's machine for the humiliating error. She confidently produced a second card and then a third. Every single account flashed the exact same red error message. Insufficient funds. Account frozen. The facade of the wealthy, untouchable golden couple shattered completely right there on the polished marble floor of the boutique. The store manager discreetly asked her to step aside, effectively treating my spoiled sister like a common vagrant trying to run a retail scam. Monica desperately called Andre, screaming into her phone right in the middle of the luxury store, only to have his voicemail pick up because he was too busy dodging aggressive calls from his furious creditors. She fled the boutique in tears, leaving the handbags behind, completely stripped of her powerful social armor. In a matter of hours, their luxurious lifestyle imploded. The luxury car dealership arrived at their upscale apartment complex to legally repossess the imported sports car Andre had leased under false financial pretenses. The exclusive country club they belonged to immediately suspended their membership for failure to pay the exorbitant monthly dues. The endless stream of extravagant dinners, designer clothes, and curated social media posts came to a violent, screeching halt. They were no longer the elite socialites of Atlanta and New York. They were completely broke, heavily indebted frauds who had destroyed their own lives through sheer, unadulterated greed. I sat back in my leather chair, looking out over the sprawling city skyline as the rain began to lightly tap against the thick glass of my office window. The storm that had thrown me out onto the freezing street 6 months ago had finally circled back, and this time it was absolutely pouring directly onto the people who had locked the door. But the destruction was not quite finished. Monica and Andre were financially ruined, but my parents still had to face the terrifying consequences of their own narcissistic gamble. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a thoroughly disinterested postal worker who required a signature before handing over the heavy manila envelope. Harrison stood in the grand foyer of the Greenwich House, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the return address, printed in stark black ink. It was the primary lending division of the National Bank, the exact institution that held the massive second mortgage he and Patricia had so arrogantly secured. He ripped the envelope open, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon until they locked onto the only words that truly mattered. Notice of intent to foreclose. The grace period had entirely evaporated. The missed payments, which had previously been seamlessly covered by my automated wire transfers, had finally triggered the catastrophic default clause. They were officially 90 days delinquent, and the bank was legally initiating the process to seize the property. Harrison dropped the paperwork onto the polished mahogany table, the very same table where they had proudly toasted to my professional demise just 6 months earlier. The blood completely drained from his face. He called for Patricia, his voice cracking with unfiltered panic. When she read the notice, her initial reaction was not fear, but extreme, indignant denial. She insisted it was a clerical error, a simple misunderstanding that could easily be rectified with a single aggressive phone call to the branch manager. But the reality of their financial destitution was absolute. They had zero liquid assets. The crypto venture was exposed as a massive federal fraud, and they did not have a single dollar left to appease the bank. The colonial fortress they had used to project their elite social status was aggressively crumbling beneath their feet. In a frantic, desperate bid for survival, Harrison decided to deploy their final imagined safety net. He rushed into his study and dialed the private number for Andre's wealthy parents down in Atlanta. For years, Patricia had relentlessly bragged about this powerful political lineage, treating their southern in-laws like an infinite reservoir of prestige and capital. Harrison paced the Persian rug, clutching the phone to his ear, fully expecting a swift, generous bailout to protect the family name. The call was answered by Andre's father, a ruthless political operator who cared exclusively about optics and public perception. Harrison nervously explained the situation, stammering through a highly sanitized version of the crypto fraud and begging for a temporary bridge loan to save the Greenwich estate. The response he received was fiercely brutal and entirely devoid of empathy. Andre's father did not offer a single cent. Instead, he coldly informed Harrison that they were actively legally distancing themselves from Andre to protect their own political campaigns from the fallout of the federal investigation. They had officially cut their son off, disinherited him, and instructed their public relations team to frame him as a rogue, estranged relative. Furthermore, he explicitly warned Harrison never to contact their estate again, aggressively stating that the financial incompetence of his northern in-laws was not an Atlanta problem. The line went completely dead. The powerful lineage my parents had bet their entire home on had just violently slammed the door in their faces, leaving them entirely isolated in their massive sinking ship. The sheer panic in the house quickly mutated into explosive, unrestrained infighting. By late afternoon, Monica and Andre arrived at the Greenwich property with nothing but a few hastily packed suitcases. They had been formally evicted from their upscale apartment, their luxury vehicles repossessed, and their credit lines entirely frozen. The moment they stepped into the foyer, the toxic family dynamic violently turned inward. The unified front they had always maintained against me completely disintegrated. Monica, her face streaked with ruined designer makeup, turned fiercely on her husband. She screamed at Andre with a vicious, unhinged intensity, entirely blaming him for stripping away her luxury lifestyle. She threw her expensive purse at his chest, hysterically demanding to know how he could be stupid enough to lose everything to a fake digital token. Andre, stripped of his fake confidence and tailored suits, yelled right back, blaming her endless shopping habits and her family's toxic pressure for pushing him into high-risk gambles. In the adjacent dining room, the screaming match between my parents was equally catastrophic. Patricia furiously attacked Harrison, her voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. She viciously blamed him for being weak, for signing the second mortgage documents, and for trusting a man who clearly had no real business acumen. Harrison fired back, his face turning a dangerous shade of red, reminding her that it was her relentless obsession with country club status and her desperate need to impress the Atlanta in-laws that drove the decision in the first place. They were four deeply narcissistic people trapped in a foreclosed house, aggressively tearing each other apart because they had finally run out of victims to exploit. As the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the grand foyer, a sudden, heavy realization washed over the exhausted group. The fighting abruptly stopped. They were entirely out of money, out of favors, and out of wealthy connections. In a moment of pure, terrifying clarity, Patricia looked at Harrison, her eyes wide with sudden desperation. They needed their utility back. They needed the silent ATM they had aggressively thrown out into the freezing rain 6 months prior. They needed me to fix the disaster they had created. Harrison grabbed his cellular phone with trembling hands and frantically scrolled through his contact list. He pulled up my name, hitting the call button, entirely expecting my familiar voicemail greeting. He expected to leave a demanding, guilt-ridden message ordering me to come home and fulfill my familial duties. He placed the phone on speaker so Patricia and Monica could hear, heavily anticipating the connection. Instead of my voice, they were met with a sterile, automated carrier message. The number you have dialed has been disconnected and is no longer in service. The automated voice repeated the brutal fact a second time before the line automatically dropped. The phone slipped from Harrison's hand, clattering loudly onto the hardwood floor. The silence in the room was absolute and entirely suffocating. I had not just ignored them, I had completely erased them from my existence. The realization finally hit them with the force of a physical blow. They were entirely alone, trapped in a house that no longer belonged to them, completely tethered to a sinking ship with absolutely no lifeboats remaining. While they sat suffocating in the dark reality of their own making, completely isolated from the wealthy connections they had worshipped, I was standing in the brightly lit conference room of Thorn Capital, finalizing the most critical transaction of my entire career. I did not operate with frantic desperation or emotional impulsivity. I operated with the cold, methodical precision of a highly trained surgeon excising a malignant tumor. 6 weeks prior, Maxwell Thorne and I had quietly established a completely anonymous holding company under the name Obsidian Financial Strategies. It was a phantom entity, a perfectly legal corporate ghost, backed entirely by an initial capital injection of $200 million from Maxwell's private equity reserves. The sole purpose of Obsidian Financial was to serve as my personal instrument of absolute conquest. I was not simply going to watch Caldwell Partners bleed out in the open market like a passive observer. I was going to systematically purchase the blood right out of their veins. By late October, the financial distress at Caldwell Partners had escalated from a severe liquidity crisis into a terminal death spiral. Gia Caldwell had exhausted every single traditional avenue of corporate salvation. Her remaining board members were in open revolt, actively seeking buyers for the firm's heavily depreciated assets. In a desperate bid to maintain operating capital during the summer, Caldwell Partners had previously issued massive amounts of high-yield corporate bonds. As the firm's credit rating plummeted to junk status, the value of that debt tanked completely. Institutional investors were frantically dumping the Caldwell bonds for pennies on the dollar, terrified of a total default. That was exactly when I deployed Obsidian Financial. Operating entirely in the shadows, I directed my team of aggressive analysts to sweep the secondary market. Over the course of 3 relentless weeks, we quietly purchased every single piece of Caldwell Partners' bad debt. We did not alert the financial press. We did not file public disclosures until the very last possible legal second. By the time Gia Caldwell realized there was a coordinated accumulation of her firm's liabilities, it was far too late. Obsidian Financial had successfully acquired 68% of the outstanding corporate debt. According to the strict covenants of the original bond agreements, a catastrophic default automatically converted that debt into controlling equity. Gia had missed her critical interest payment by a margin of 12 hours. In the blink of an eye, the legal conversion was officially executed. I was the absolute majority shareholder and the undisputed owner of Caldwell Partners. But acquiring the firm was only the professional half of my masterstroke. The personal vengeance required a completely different venue and a much quieter approach. While my elite legal team was aggressively finalizing the corporate takeover in Manhattan, I was personally attending a highly discreet foreclosure auction at the county courthouse in Connecticut. It was a bleak, heavily bureaucratic affair, held in a sterile municipal room, attended primarily by aggressive real estate speculators and local bank representatives. I sat quietly in the back row, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and oversized sunglasses, remaining entirely unrecognized by the local investors. When the Greenwich property was finally brought up to the auction block, the starting bid was set exactly at the staggering remaining balance of the defaulted second mortgage. It was an astronomical number for a single residential property, completely scaring off the local flippers who were strictly looking for cheap assets. The auctioneer called the starting figure, his monotone voice echoing loudly across the empty rows of wooden benches. Absolute silence filled the room. No one raised a paddle or even whispered an offer. The bank representative looked incredibly relieved, fully expecting the massive property to automatically revert back to their corporate real estate portfolio. I waited patiently until the auctioneer began his final countdown. Going once, going twice. I calmly raised my numbered paddle in the air, holding it steady. The auctioneer paused mid-sentence, visibly shocked that a single buyer was willing to absorb the massive financial burden in a single cash transaction without requesting a property inspection. Sold, he announced, loudly slamming his heavy wooden gavel onto the podium. I stood up, walked directly to the clerk's desk, and handed over a certified cashier's check, officially drawn from my private Obsidian financial accounts. The paperwork was swiftly processed, signed, and stamped with the heavy county seal. I folded the deed into my leather briefcase and walked out into the crisp autumn air. I climbed into the back of my waiting town car and instructed the driver to take me back to the city. I placed the briefcase on the leather seat next to me and finally let out a long, slow breath. The sheer magnitude of what I had accomplished over the last 7 days settled heavily into my chest, replacing the lingering coldness of my family's betrayal with a burning, undeniable power. I opened the briefcase and looked at the 2 distinct stacks of legal documents resting inside. On the left side was the controlling equity transfer of Caldwell Partners signed and certified by the Federal Regulatory Commission. On the right side was the absolute deed to the sprawling colonial estate in Greenwich, legally transferred directly into my name. In less than a single week, I had completely rewritten the entire power dynamic of my existence. Gia Caldwell was currently sitting in her lavish corner office, entirely unaware that the chair she was sitting in legally belonged to me. She still believed she was the untouchable CEO, completely oblivious to the fact that she was now my direct subordinate, subject to my immediate termination at any given moment. Simultaneously, my parents, my sister, and my utterly useless former brother-in-law were huddled together in the Greenwich house, terrified of the impending bank eviction. They were violently turning on each other, desperately waiting for the authorities to show up and forcefully remove them from the premises. They had absolutely no idea that the bank no longer owned their house. I did. The woman they had coldly cast out into the freezing rain, the daughter they had treated like an expendable financial utility, was now their absolute, undisputed landlord. They had arrogantly demanded that I learn how to bow my head. Instead, I had methodically purchased the entire ground they were standing on. I picked up my phone and drafted a quick, highly concise email to my security team. It was time to arrange a couple of extremely personal surprise visits. 72 hours later, I was sitting in the plush leather seat of a blacked-out luxury SUV, staring intently at the glowing screen of my encrypted tablet. My newly acquired private security team had already secured the perimeter of the Caldwell Partners building, seamlessly infiltrating the lobby to ensure my arrival would be entirely uninterrupted. But my attention was focused entirely on the live audio and video feed streaming directly from the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor. The very same room where I had spent countless hours building the firm was now serving as a luxurious holding cell for the desperate and the defeated. The massive mahogany table, once a symbol of unshakable financial power, was completely bare, except for a single thick stack of legal documents resting at the center. It was the absolute unconditional surrender agreement. The firm was literally hours away from a catastrophic public liquidation, and Obsidian Financial Strategies was the only entity standing between the remaining executives and total professional ruin. I turned up the volume on my tablet, listening to the frantic, panicked voices echoing through the boardroom. Gia Caldwell was pacing aggressively back and forth in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, her expensive designer heels sinking heavily into the plush carpet. The arrogant, untouchable aura she had radiated on her first day as chief executive officer had completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, suffocating terror. She looked exhausted, her posture rigid and her hands visibly trembling as she clutched a leather-bound notebook. Seated around the table were the 4 remaining senior vice presidents, a group of spineless aging men who had silently watched her drive the company into a mountain of toxic debt. They were sweating profusely in their tailored suits, constantly checking their expensive luxury watches, and aggressively wiping their foreheads with silk handkerchiefs. They were trapped in a nightmare of their own making, entirely reliant on the mercy of an anonymous holding group they knew absolutely nothing about. "Listen to me, gentlemen!" Gia barked, her voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. She stopped pacing and slammed her hands down on the back of a leather chair. "We have one single opportunity to secure our positions within this new corporate structure. The representatives from Obsidian Financial will be walking through those doors any minute. We must present a completely unified front. We cannot look desperate, and we absolutely cannot let them know the true extent of the liquidity crisis in our international divisions." One of the senior vice presidents, a man named Robert, who had personally authorized my immediate termination, let out a pathetic, nervous laugh. "Gia, they bought all of our bad debt." Robert stammered, his face pale and slick with sweat. "They already know exactly how much trouble we are in. They hold the controlling equity. The only reason they are coming here in person is to officially sign the transition papers and decide which of us gets to keep a paycheck. We are entirely at their mercy." Gia shot him a look of pure, unrestrained venom. "We are not at their mercy, Robert," she snapped desperately, trying to salvage her shattered ego. "I am still a Caldwell. My family built this firm from the ground up. Whoever this billionaire owner is, they bought this company because of the prestigious legacy attached to our name. They need my face to keep the remaining clients calm. When the Obsidian owner walks in, I will handle the negotiations. I will personally explain that the recent market downturn was a temporary anomaly caused by incompetent lower-level staff like Jason and Kendra. I will assure him that under my continued guidance as a subsidiary president, we can restore profitability within 2 quarters. Just keep your mouth shut and let me do the talking." I smiled coldly in the back of the SUV, tapping the screen of my tablet to close the video feed. Gia was still operating under the severe, deeply ingrained delusion that she was dealing with an old, traditional Wall Street billionaire who would be easily charmed by her lineage and her practiced corporate vocabulary. She actually believed she was about to negotiate a lucrative subsidiary role. She was about to discover that the anonymous holding group did not purchase her firm to save her legacy. I purchased it to completely eradicate it. I signaled my driver, and the heavy vehicle pulled smoothly up to the curb directly in front of the Caldwell Partners' main entrance. My lead security officer opened the door and I stepped out onto the bustling Manhattan sidewalk. I was not wearing the exhausted, overworked trench coat of a corporate foot soldier. I was wearing a bespoke, razor-sharp white suit, projecting an aura of absolute, undisputed authority. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling marble lobby. The exact same security guards who had aggressively confiscated my badge and escorted me off the premises just 6 months prior were now standing rigidly at attention, hastily clearing a path for me and my security detail. They had been informed by the Obsidian transition team that the new majority owner was arriving, and they were terrified of making eye contact. I bypassed the reception desk entirely and walked directly into the private executive elevator. I pressed the button for the 42nd floor and watched the digital numbers tick upward in absolute silence. The physical sensation of power settling in my chest was intoxicating. I was returning to the scene of my greatest public humiliation, not to ask for forgiveness, but to officially take possession of the entire building. The elevator chimed softly, and the polished metal doors slid open. I stepped out into the lavish executive hallway. The entire floor was eerily silent, the usual chaotic energy of the trading desks and strategy rooms completely extinguished by the impending bankruptcy. I walked slowly down the corridor, the rhythmic sharp clicking of my heels echoing loudly against the marble floors. I knew exactly how that sound was registering inside the boardroom. Through the thick mahogany doors, I could hear the immediate terrified rustling of the executives inside. I heard chairs quickly scraping against the carpet as the men hastily stood up to show respect. I heard Robert loudly clearing his throat, his breath hitching in panic. "Stand up straight, gentlemen," Gia hissed aggressively from the other side of the door, her voice vibrating with desperate anticipation. "Remember your talking points. Project confidence. Welcome the new owner with absolute respect." I stopped right in front of the massive double doors, placing my hands firmly against the cool brass handles. The air in the hallway felt incredibly charged, heavy, with the weight of absolute vengeance. They were inside practicing their pathetic speeches, desperately hoping to impress a phantom billionaire. I took one final steadying breath, letting the icy resolve completely freeze over my emotions. Then, with a single forceful push, I shoved the heavy mahogany doors wide open and stepped into the boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors crashed violently against the boardroom walls, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the suffocating silence of the room. I stepped over the threshold entirely bathed in the harsh fluorescent lights of the executive suite. I was not wearing the bespoke white suit my security team had initially laid out for me that morning. Instead, I had specifically chosen to wear the exact same cream-tailored pantsuit I had worn 6 months prior. The very same suit I had been wearing when Gia Caldwell callously stripped me of my dignity and ordered security to throw me out onto the street. It was meticulously pressed, completely spotless, and carried the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute poetic justice. I stood frozen in this doorway for a fraction of a second, allowing the sheer magnitude of the moment to completely saturate the room. The initial reaction from the men standing around the table was utter, profound confusion. They had prepared themselves to greet an anonymous billionaire, a faceless titan of Wall Street. Instead, they were staring at the woman they had eagerly sacrificed to save their own pathetic careers. Robert, the senior vice president, actually took a physical step backward, his jaw dropping open in stunned disbelief. But the most exquisite reaction belonged to Gia. She was standing at the far end of the room, positioned right next to her aging father, Richard Caldwell. Richard had apparently been dragged out of his comfortable retirement to help his daughter beg the new corporate overlords for mercy. When Gia saw my face, the color aggressively drained from her skin, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. Her arrogant posture completely collapsed. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but her vocal cords completely failed her. Richard stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and mounting horror, as he slowly recognized the woman his daughter had so foolishly discarded. I did not wait for an invitation. I walked slowly and deliberately into the room, the sharp clicking of my heels breaking the paralyzed silence. The executives hastily scrambled out of my way, parting like the Red Sea, as I bypassed the empty guest chairs and walked directly to the massive leather chair at the absolute head of the table, the very chair Gia had aggressively claimed as her birthright. I placed my hands on the leather armrests, turned around, and sat down. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard Caldwell finally choked out, his voice trembling with a mixture of elderly frailty and rising panic. "Where is the representative from Obsidian Financial? You do not belong in this building, Kendra. Security will be called immediately." I leaned back in the chair, crossing my legs with elegant, terrifying precision. I looked directly into Richard's panicked eyes. I am Obsidian Financial. I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion, but echoing with absolute authority. I am the sole proprietor of the holding group that purchased every single piece of your toxic corporate debt. I executed the default clause at midnight. I am your new owner. The words landed like a physical bomb in the center of the boardroom. Robert let out a pathetic, suffocating gasp and collapsed heavily into his chair. Gia staggered backward, hitting the glass wall behind her. "That is a lie," she shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "That is absolutely impossible. You are a fired employee. You do not have the capital to buy this firm. This is a sick joke." I calmly reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out the certified equity transfer documents, and tossed them aggressively across the polished mahogany table. They slid directly in front of Gia. "Read them," I commanded sharply. "Read the federal stamps. Read the majority shareholder clause. You played corporate dress-up with your father's money, Gia, and you completely bankrupted his legacy in less than 6 months. Now I own it all." Richard Caldwell practically lunged at the documents, his trembling hands frantically flipping through the heavily stamped pages. As his eyes scanned the legal transfer of power, his breathing became shallow and erratic. He looked at his daughter, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated disgust. "You fool," he whispered hoarsely to Gia. "You arrogant, stupid fool. You handed our entire family legacy to a woman you threw away." Gia began to sob violently, her perfectly curated makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "Please, Kendra," she begged, taking a step toward me with her hands clasped tightly together. "Please. This company is my entire life. My name is on the wall. I will step down as chief executive officer. I will take a massive pay cut. Just let me stay on the board. Let my father keep his advisory pension. We can work for you." I stared at her crying face, feeling absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction. "You fired me on your very first day to flex your unearned power," I replied, my voice slicing through her pathetic sobbing. "You let Jason and Andre try to steal my $8 billion client. You stood by while I was humiliated in the lobby. I am not here to offer you a job, Gia. I am here to execute a purge." I stood up, resting my hands flat on the mahogany table. "As of this exact second, you are legally terminated from Caldwell Partners," I announced, my gaze shifting rapidly between Gia and the remaining executives. "Your employment contracts are completely voided under the new ownership restructuring clause. You will receive absolutely zero severance pay. Your health benefits are canceled immediately. Furthermore, I have already contacted the Federal Regulatory Commission regarding Andre's fraudulent crypto activities. He is permanently blacklisted from the financial sector, and I am formally submitting Caldwell internal emails proving your board was complicit in his unregulated trades." Robert began to quietly cry into his hands. Richard Caldwell clutched his chest, sinking slowly into a chair as the sheer magnitude of their ruin set in. "There is no board of directors anymore." I continued, delivering the final fatal blow. "Because Caldwell Partners no longer exists. I am completely dissolving this company by the end of the business day. Every single remaining asset, client portfolio, and piece of intellectual property is being aggressively absorbed into Thorn Capital operations. This building will be entirely emptied by tomorrow morning. Your prestigious legacy is officially dead." I raised my hand and snapped my fingers loudly. The heavy boardroom doors instantly swung open, and 6 massive private security officers stepped into the room. They did not wear the standard Caldwell uniforms. They wore the tactical black suits of my personal security detail. "Escort them out," I ordered coldly, gesturing toward the weeping executives. "Strip them of their digital security badges, confiscate all corporate phones, and ensure they do not take a single piece of paper from this room." Gia let out a guttural, agonizing scream as 2 heavily armored security guards grabbed her by the arms, dragging her forcefully away from the glass windows. She thrashed and kicked against their grip, sobbing uncontrollably, begging her father to do something to stop the nightmare. But Richard Caldwell was completely broken. He offered absolutely no resistance. He simply allowed the guards to pull him to his feet, his shoulders slumped and his head bowed in absolute devastating shame as he was marched out of the room he had spent 4 decades building. I stood in absolute silence at the head of the empty mahogany table, listening to their pathetic wails echo loudly down the marble hallway. The sounds grew fainter and fainter until the heavy metal elevator doors finally clamped shut, permanently sealing their professional doom and securing my undisputed empire. The echo of the heavy metal elevator doors clamping shut on the Caldwell family was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I stood alone in the center of the completely silent boardroom for exactly 1 minute, savoring the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to bury me. But the adrenaline surging through my veins demanded forward momentum. Half of my empire was successfully secured, but the most deeply personal transaction was still waiting for me in the wealthy suburbs of Connecticut. I walked out of the glass boardroom, bypassed the terrified, whispering administrative staff, and rode the private elevator down to the lobby. My lead security officer was waiting by the revolving doors. I gave him a curt nod, instructing him to follow me with the secondary tactical team. It was time to visit Greenwich. The drive out of the city took slightly over an hour, giving me ample time to mentally prepare for the pathetic spectacle I was about to walk into. I had instructed my private investigators to keep a close watch on my parents' estate ever since the bank officially issued the foreclosure notice. According to the live updates pinging on my encrypted tablet, the toxic environment inside the house had devolved from explosive infighting into a highly performative pity party. Harrison and Patricia, completely devoid of any real solutions, had apparently invited a small group of extended relatives over to witness their tragic martyrdom. They were hosting a tearful victim, playing gathering disguised as a packing party, desperately trying to control the narrative of their financial collapse before the wealthy Connecticut rumor mill could accurately label them as frauds. My black SUV glided smoothly up the familiar circular driveway, parking directly behind a row of luxury vehicles belonging to my wealthy aunts and uncles. The rain from earlier in the week had vanished, replaced by a cold, biting autumn wind that stripped the leaves from the ancient oak trees lining the property. I stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp air instantly chilling my face. I instructed my security team to wait by the vehicles until I gave the signal. This initial confrontation required absolute intimacy. I walked up the stone steps, bypassed the doorbell entirely, and pulled out the heavy brass key I had received from the county clerk. I slid it into the lock, turned it with a satisfying click, and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The grand foyer, usually pristine and aggressively curated to intimidate guests, was a chaotic mess of brown cardboard boxes and rolls of bubble wrap. The expensive Persian rugs were rolled up and shoved into corners. I closed the front door silently behind me, my tailored cream pantsuit blending perfectly into the pale shadows of the hallway. The sound of clinking glasses and overly dramatic sobbing drifted out from the formal living room. I walked softly across the hardwood floor, positioning myself just outside the double archways, completely hidden from their view, but with a perfect vantage point of the entire room. Monica was sprawled across a velvet sofa, clutching a half-empty glass of cheap white wine. Her designer makeup was ruined and she looked utterly destroyed. But she was not crying over the loss of her childhood home. She was hysterically weeping over a completely different betrayal. Through the muffled conversations, the truth became aggressively clear. Andre was gone. The visionary genius, the man with the powerful political lineage who was supposed to elevate our family into the stratosphere, had cowardly fled the state in the middle of the night. The moment he caught wind that federal regulators were preparing official indictments for his fraudulent crypto scheme, he packed a single duffel bag, drained whatever hidden cash reserves he had left, and abandoned Monica entirely. He left his spoiled, helpless wife to face the furious creditors, the federal agents, and the crushing humiliation completely alone. Patricia, meanwhile, was standing near the grand fireplace, holding court with my Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Thomas. My mother was wrapped in an expensive cashmere shawl, actively dabbing her dry eyes with a silk tissue. She was delivering an award-winning theatrical performance, expertly spinning a web of absolute lies to protect her fragile ego. "It is just so unbelievably cruel, Beatrice." Patricia wailed, her voice thick with manufactured grief. "We did everything for our children. We sacrificed our entire lives to give them a foundation of success. And the absolute moment we faced a minor financial setback, Kendra completely turned her back on us." Harrison stood next to her, packing crystal decanters into a box with aggressive, angry motions. "She is an ungrateful, selfish girl," my father chimed in, seeking validation from his wealthy brother. "We practically begged her to help us navigate this temporary cash flow issue. We asked for a simple temporary bridge loan. But she ignored our calls. She abandoned her family in our darkest hour of need, completely forgetting who paid for her education and who put a roof over her head for 18 years. I stood in the shadows, my jaw clenching so tightly, my teeth ached. They were standing inside a house I had financed for years, packing up luxury items I had subsidized, and aggressively painting me as the villain to cover up their own massive, fraudulent gamble. But Patricia was not finished. Having thoroughly assassinated my character, she swiftly redirected her venom toward the legal forces currently evicting them. She dramatically poured herself another glass of wine, her hands shaking with genuine narcissistic rage. "And the bank is even worse than Kendra," she proclaimed loudly, ensuring everyone in the room could hear her tragic plight. "They refused to give us a standard 60-day extension. They rushed the foreclosure auction just to humiliate us, and then some coward swooped in and bought the debt out from under us." Aunt Beatrice gasped softly, placing a comforting hand on Patricia's shoulder. "Do you know who bought it, Patricia? Did they even try to contact you?" Patricia let out a bitter, echoing laugh. "Of course not," she spat fiercely. "It was an anonymous buyer, some faceless holding company hiding behind a team of aggressive lawyers. They sent us an official notice to vacate the premises by 5 o'clock today. No room for negotiation, no respect for our legacy in this neighborhood. Whoever this anonymous buyer is, they have absolutely no heart. They are a cruel, heartless monster who clearly enjoys destroying good, honest families." I reached up and smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from the lapel of my tailored suit. My mother wanted a monster. She was about to get the absolute, undisputed queen of them. I took a deep, steadying breath, stepped out of the shadows of the hallway, and walked directly into the center of the formal living room. I stepped fully out of the hallway shadows and into the glaring light of the chandelier. My sudden appearance instantly shattered the pathetic theatrical illusion my mother had so carefully constructed for our extended relatives. Patricia gasped loudly, her wineglass slipping from her trembling fingers and shattering into jagged, glittering pieces across the polished hardwood floor. Harrison froze in place, the expensive crystal decanter hovering awkwardly in his hands. My Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Thomas stared at me in absolute stunned silence, their eyes darting frantically between my pristine cream pantsuit and the devastated, horrified expressions of my parents. I did not scream. I did not hurl emotional insults, and I did not demand any tearful apologies. I was terrifyingly composed, operating with the cold mechanical precision of a corporate executioner. Before my parents could even attempt to process my presence, I turned my head slightly toward the foyer and gave a sharp single nod. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany front door swung violently open. I had instructed my legal team to wait outside until the initial shock was delivered, but now it was time to execute the final maneuver. 3 of my top corporate attorneys, dressed in immaculate dark suits and carrying heavy leather briefcases, marched aggressively into my childhood home. They were closely flanked by 2 massive private security officers who immediately positioned themselves at the main exits, effectively sealing the room. The sheer overwhelming intimidation of my professional entourage sucked every single ounce of remaining oxygen out of the formal living room. "What is the absolute meaning of this?" Harrison finally demanded, his voice cracking violently with a mixture of forced elderly authority and rapidly rising panic. "You cannot just barge into our home with armed guards and lawyers, Kendra. This is private property. Get out of this house before I call the local police." I completely ignored his pathetic, empty threat. I walked right past him, the sharp clicking of my heels echoing loudly against the floorboards, and moved deliberately into the sprawling custom-designed chef's kitchen. The entire family, driven by a morbid and terrified curiosity, awkwardly followed behind me like a flock of defeated sheep. I stopped directly in front of the massive marble island. It was the exact same spot where Patricia had aggressively lectured me about my financial failures and cast me out into the freezing rain just a few short months prior. My lead attorney stepped forward in absolute silence, unlatched his heavy briefcase, and handed me a thick, heavily stamped manila folder. I pulled the official county documents from the folder and held them up in the bright, unforgiving kitchen lighting. I looked directly into my mother's terrified, sunken eyes. "You were just loudly complaining to Aunt Beatrice about the heartless, anonymous buyer who purchased your defaulted mortgage at the county auction?" I said, my voice completely devoid of any human emotion, slicing through the tense silence like a surgical blade. "You claimed this anonymous monster had absolutely no respect for your prestigious neighborhood legacy. You were furious that the bank sent you a mandatory non-negotiable eviction notice by 5 o'clock today." I calmly raised my hand and forcefully dropped the heavy stack of legal documents directly onto the marble kitchen counter. The heavy, authoritative thud echoed loudly in the cavernous room. "I am the anonymous buyer," I announced, my unwavering gaze sweeping across the stunned, ashen faces of my parents and my sister. "I am the sole proprietor of Obsidian Financial Strategies. I bought this entire estate in a single, uncontested cash transaction this morning. This is no longer your home. It is my legally acquired property." The devastating realization hit Patricia and Harrison like a physical, crippling blow to the chest. My mother actually staggered backward, clutching the edge of the granite countertop so hard her knuckles turned entirely white, desperately trying to prevent herself from collapsing onto the floor. Her manufactured theatrical tears instantly vanished completely, replaced by a raw, suffocating horror. Harrison stared blankly at the property deed resting on the island, his jaw hanging open as he frantically read the official federal stamps and my legally binding signature resting at the bottom of the page. He reached out with a violently trembling hand, lightly touching the thick parchment as if it might physically burn his skin. Monica let out a pathetic, whimpering sob from the kitchen doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around her own stomach. The daughter they had coldly thrown away, the child they had deemed entirely expendable in their desperate pursuit of high society status, was now holding their entire physical existence in the palm of her hand. I had not just defeated them in the corporate arena. I had methodically purchased the very ground they were standing on. "But you cannot do this," Patricia whispered, her voice incredibly small, frail, and dripping with desperate manipulation. "You are our daughter. You cannot legally evict your own family. We have absolutely nowhere else to go. Andre completely drained our remaining accounts and fled the state. We are ruined, Kendra. Please, you have to let us stay here." I leaned forward, resting my palms flat against the cool marble counter. My demeanor remained entirely composed, projecting a terrifying mirror of the exact same coldness they had shown me on the worst night of my life. "You made it incredibly clear that I was not a part of this family. The absolute moment I stopped being financially useful to your image," I replied, my tone razor-sharp and entirely unforgiving. "You cast me out with nothing. You demanded that I learn how the real world works. I learned exactly how it works, Mother, and I used that knowledge to buy the bank that owned your debt." I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my pristine cream suit, and prepared to deliver the final absolute checkmate. "As the legal owner of this estate, I am technically authorized to have my security team physically throw you and your boxes out onto the street right this very second," I stated clearly, my voice projecting perfectly across the dead silent room. "But I am not going to do that. The original bank notice demanded you vacate today. I am officially overriding that order." I paused for a single agonizing second, letting the weight of my authority completely crush their remaining hope. "You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property," I commanded. "You have exactly 1 month to pack your personal belongings, find a cheap apartment, and disappear from this neighborhood entirely. You will spend the next 30 days agonizing over your absolute failure while the rest of your wealthy friends watch you pack. If a single piece of furniture, a single crystal glass, or a single light fixture is missing or damaged, when I take physical possession of this house, my attorneys will immediately file aggressive civil lawsuits that will financially bury you for the rest of your natural lives. Harrison buried his face in his trembling hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, profoundly humiliated sobs. My powerful, untouchable father was completely broken, reduced to a weeping shell of a man in front of his own brother and sister. Patricia stared at me, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated magnitude of her defeat. The social empire she had spent decades ruthlessly building was officially dead, entirely dismantled by the very daughter she had arrogantly tried to destroy. The checkmate was absolute, flawless, and completely irreversible. I turned around, signaling my security detail that our business in the kitchen was officially concluded. I did not look back a single time as I walked confidently toward the front door, leaving my ruined family entirely trapped in the suffocating, inescapable wreckage of their own shattered arrogance. The first 48 hours following my absolute victory in Greenwich were filled with a profound, unbroken silence. I had officially relocated my entire life into a secure, ultra-luxury penthouse occupying the top 2 floors of a towering glass high-rise in Lower Manhattan. It was a flawless fortress of modern architecture, heavily guarded by a private security detail and a heavily vetted concierge team. I spent my days methodically liquidating the remaining toxic assets of Caldwell Partners and integrating their profitable client portfolios directly into Thorn Capital. The transition was a staggering financial success, cementing my status as a devastatingly effective corporate strategist. I was completely untouchable. But desperation is a highly unpredictable poison, and my family had just swallowed a lethal dose of it. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the secure intercom on my massive oak desk chimed loudly. My head of private security informed me that a severe disturbance was unfolding in the private lobby of my building. Patricia Harrison and Monica had somehow managed to bypass the outer security perimeter by aggressively tailgating a catering delivery truck. They were currently trapped in the main reception area, throwing a hysterical, incredibly public tantrum and demanding immediate access to my private elevator. And according to my security chief, they had brought a deeply unwelcome guest with them. Jason. My treacherous, opportunistic ex-fiancé had apparently caught wind of my massive financial ascension and decided to crawl out of his miserable hole to join the pathetic ambush. Instead of instructing security to simply throw them into the street like common trespassers, I made a calculated decision. I wanted to look them in the eyes one final time and permanently sever the rotting umbilical cord. I stepped into my private elevator and rode it down to the ground floor. When the polished silver doors slid open, the sheer contrast between my current reality and their absolute ruin was visually staggering. The lobby was a masterpiece of black marble and cascading water features, radiating quiet old money power. Standing in the center of it, entirely surrounded by 4 heavily armed security guards, were the pathetic remnants of my former life. Patricia looked completely haggard, her expensive designer coat wrinkled and her perfectly dyed hair unkempt. Harrison was trembling violently, his shoulders hunched in deep, paralyzing defeat. Monica was clutching her mother's arm, weeping openly, and standing slightly ahead of them wearing a cheap suit and a desperate, sickeningly hopeful smile was Jason. Kendra. Jason gasped, taking a rapid step forward before a security guard shoved a massive hand against his chest, stopping him instantly. Kendra, you look absolutely incredible. I knew you were going to pull off something brilliant. That is exactly why I loved you. We were always the perfect power couple. Everything that happened at Caldwell Partners was just a massive misunderstanding driven by Gia and her toxic management. I am completely ready to apologize and start over. With your new capital and my market connections, we could absolutely rule this city together. I stared at him, feeling a wave of absolute unadulterated revulsion wash over me. The sheer audacity required to stand in my lobby and propose a business partnership after aggressively helping destroy my career was mind-boggling. I did not even grant him the dignity of a full sentence. "You have absolutely no market connections, Jason," I stated, my voice echoing like ice against the marble walls. "You are a blacklisted radioactive liability who cannot even secure a basic interview at a retail bank. You sold me out for a promotion that no longer exists in a company I just dissolved. You are a parasite looking for a new host. Remove him." Two security guards immediately grabbed Jason by the arms, effortlessly lifting him off his feet. He began to frantically thrash and scream my name, begging for a second chance, as they dragged him backward through the heavy glass doors and physically threw him out onto the unforgiving Manhattan pavement. I did not blink. I turned my absolute undivided attention to my parents. Patricia instantly dropped to her knees on the cold marble, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her high society dignity. She clasped her hands together, tears streaming heavily down her ruined face. "Kendra, please," she wailed, her voice echoing shrilly in the cavernous lobby. "Please forgive us. We were so incredibly wrong. We were blinded by our own panic and we made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. You cannot kick us out of the house. We have absolutely nowhere to go. We are your mother and father. We gave you life. You have to let us stay. You have to remember that we are blood." Harrison fell to his knees right beside her, his head bowed in absolute crushing shame. "We are so sorry, Kendra," he whispered hoarsely, completely broken. "We will do anything you ask. We will pay you rent. We will sign whatever legal contracts you want. Just please do not throw your own family out onto the street." I looked down at them, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of decades of conditional affection completely lifting from my shoulders. The anger that had fueled my vengeance for the past 6 months instantly evaporated, replaced by a terrifying absolute clarity. I did not feel pity. I did not feel sadness. I felt entirely free. "Blood is nothing but a biological coincidence," I replied, my voice steady, powerful, and ringing with absolute conviction. "You are attempting to cash in a currency that you completely bankrupted years ago. Do not dare kneel in my lobby and use the word family to manipulate me. I know exactly how you define family. You define it by financial utility. You define it by social compliance. You define it by how flawlessly I could act as an accessory to your completely fabricated, fraudulent lives." Monica let out a loud, choking sob, burying her face in her trembling hands. "You are so incredibly cruel," she wept bitterly. "Cruel," I repeated, stepping closer to them, my presence dominating the physical space. "I spent my entire adult life funding your lavish lifestyles. I paid your secondary mortgages. I bought your luxury cars. I quietly fixed every single one of Andre's catastrophic financial mistakes just to keep the peace, while you treated Monica like a delicate princess and treated me like a corporate workhorse. And the absolute moment I needed a fraction of that support, the moment I was falsely accused and violently thrown out of my own company, you looked at me with pure disgust. You called me a failure. You ordered me to pack my bags and forced me out into the freezing rain because I was no longer a profitable asset to your public image." I paused, letting the absolute truth of my words sink into their terrified minds. I crouched down slightly, ensuring I was completely eye level with my weeping mother. "Family stands with you in the storm," I whispered, my voice dripping with lethal precision. "You locked the door while I was freezing. You are not my family. You are just bad investments, and as of this exact moment, I am permanently liquidating you from my portfolio." Patricia let out a guttural, agonizing scream, reaching out to grab the hem of my tailored pantsuit. I stepped back smoothly, remaining entirely out of her desperate reach. I stood up tall, projecting the absolute untouchable authority of a woman who had completely conquered her own destruction. I looked at my head of security. "Escort them off the premises," I ordered coldly. "If any of them attempt to approach this building, my office, or my property in Greenwich ever again, you are to immediately involve the police and press maximum harassment charges. They no longer exist to me." I turned my back on them, and walked slowly toward my private elevator. The lobby instantly erupted into chaotic, hysterical screaming. Patricia wailed my name, begging and pleading for mercy, as the heavily armored security guards forcefully dragged her and Harrison across the polished marble floor. Monica blindly stumbled after them, sobbing uncontrollably, as the reality of her total abandonment finally crushed her. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the glowing button for the penthouse, and turned around to watch the final pathetic remnants of my past being aggressively shoved out into the cold, unforgiving city streets. The heavy glass doors slammed shut permanently, cutting off their desperate cries. The silver elevator doors smoothly closed in front of me, sealing me inside a quiet, ascending sanctuary of absolute, undisputed power. The ascent to the penthouse was not just a physical elevation. It was the final, undeniable transition into a completely new stratosphere of existence. The dust from the Caldwell collapse settled incredibly fast, completely burying those who had desperately tried to cling to the wreckage. Over the next 6 months, the absolute reality of their actions caught up with every single one of them in spectacular, devastating fashion. I did not have to lift another finger. I simply sat back and watched the natural consequences of their own toxic greed completely devour their lives. The federal indictments against Andre came down fast and mercilessly. The internal emails and encrypted ledgers I had anonymously forwarded to the Regulatory Commission were entirely airtight, completely exposing the massive unregulated crypto syndicate he had been running through the Caldwell servers. He did not get to enjoy his cowardly escape for very long. A federal task force tracked him down to a cheap cash-only motel in Central Florida. He was dragged out into the sweltering heat in handcuffs, wearing a stained T-shirt, his terrified face instantly plastered across the front page of every major financial publication in the country. He is currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility, completely denied bail, facing a mandatory minimum of 25 years for severe wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Monica refuses to divorce him, clinging to the pathetic delusion that he was simply misunderstood. She visits him once a month, entirely isolated and permanently branded by high society as the oblivious, enabling wife of a disgraced financial criminal. Jason discovered very quickly that karma in the corporate world is absolutely ruthless. His desperate, pathetic attempt to crawl back to me in my lobby was his final futile play. With Caldwell Partners completely dissolved and his professional reputation officially flagged as a radioactive liability, the prestigious Wall Street sector permanently locked its doors to him. He could not even secure a preliminary interview at a regional bank. I occasionally receive highly amusing updates from my former colleagues. The arrogant man who confidently threw away our entire future and shattered my heart for a hollow corporate title is now working as a customer service manager at a massive discount electronics retailer in suburban New Jersey. He spends his grueling 10-hour shifts wearing an uncomfortable polyester uniform, organizing dusty stockrooms, and arguing with hostile customers over expired return policies. He is trapped in a dead-end retail purgatory, watching his youth, his ambition, and his inflated ego completely evaporate under harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights. But the most profound justice was served to Patricia and Harrison. The strict 30-day eviction notice I issued was executed flawlessly by my legal team. When the final day arrived, they were forced to pack their heavily downgraded possessions into a cheap rented moving truck in the dead of night. They were too profoundly ashamed to show their faces during the day, terrified of making eye contact with the wealthy Connecticut neighbors they had spent decades desperately trying to impress. The sprawling Greenwich estate they worshipped, the house they had violently kicked me out of, was immediately gutted, renovated by my contractors, and flipped to a tech billionaire for a massive, unprecedented profit. I completely erased their precious legacy from the neighborhood without leaving a single trace.